Cool, we're going to get started in about 30 seconds. Just a few quick house rules. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please raise your hand. We will also have lots of time for questions at the end. We're going to try and get questions from as many different people as possible. So if you have a question that you really want to ask, that's great. If you want to save it for later on, I'm probably only going to ask you the once. So we'll try and get that spread throughout everyone. If you have any discussions amongst yourselves that you want to have about what's going on, that's fine. Just keep it super quiet if you can. And any discussions about what's not going on, that can wait till after the presentation. Cool, all good. Ready? Let's go. So welcome to my presentation on field space and throwing shapes. Not this kind of throwing shapes. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how I perceive the ultimate field in play and in drills, and how I utilize my throwing to hit those particular spaces, again, in games or in drills at training. So we're going to touch on how I split up the field, traditional offenses and their spaces, increasing the active space, and how we utilize clearing in our spacing. And then throwing shapes, we're going to talk about touch, we're going to talk about the receiving sphere, and throwing and receiving angles. Cool. So everyone's seen a field like this before. We have a horizontal stack. We have the disc on the right-hand side here. Now, generally how I like to perceive the field when I'm playing Ultimate is by splitting it up into 9 sections. So some of you may have seen the thirds before. A lot of thirds get talked about when we're talking about hucking. We shouldn't huck in the same third. We should look for people in the opposite third, etc., etc. But then we also have these 2 splits along on the brick mark as well. So I like to think of a shallow space, a handler space, and a deep space within those vertical thirds as well. I use the word, the phrase planes a lot. So vertical planes, horizontal planes. So if I use that through this presentation, that's what I'm referring to. Something else I'm going to refer to a lot in the session is high value and lower value options. And that is going to be talking about how we utilize these different sections of the field to gain more yards. Highest value option is usually throwing a hook for a goal. Lower value option is usually losing lots of yards backwards. And so we're going to be talking about how utilizing the different spaces on the field can provide higher value options versus lower value options. So the general rule I try to work by: if there are multiple people in the same sector, that's too many. And there's 2 kind of parts to that thought process. As a thrower, if I'm trying to hit a receiver and there is someone else in that sector as well, maybe that's not the option. Maybe too many people in there, it's a little bit of a tighter space. There are now 2 defenders trying to get the block. That also means that as a cutter, I need to be able to recognize if I'm in that same sector as well, as someone who is either already in the space or is going to be providing a higher value option. So depending on the location of the disc and the structure of the offense, the different sectors will become more or less active. So our traditional offenses, got your vert stack. So when the disc is on the right-hand side here, we see the green circle here is our active space. So we have 2 very big sectors, nice and open to throw into. We also have 2 very big sectors free and open on the far side of the field, but we also have a force and a stack in the way, trying to prevent that. So generally, this is going to be our easiest to throw to, highest value sectors of the field. Next up is probably the break side of the field. Those are, again, free sectors, but more difficult to throw to. And then we have only 1 person in the reset space, and they have 2 whole sectors, and maybe half a sector down here to work with as well. So the reason vert can work quite well is we keep everyone in the middle of the field, and we create 2 big channels to work down. Similarly with horizontal, instead of going vertically, we are stacking horizontally across the field, and we've brought one of our receivers down into the handler space. So now we've created a wider channel in front of the cutters and a much bigger 3-sector deep area that we're looking to generally hit in horizontal. We will see a lot more completions on hooks from static and from pulls in horizontal than we would from vert because of this, because we have huge space here. Now, how do we ensure that these high-value options, high-value sectors, are kept available for people to cut into? So the first thing that we can do is adapt the structure. Now, those pictures that we looked at of vert and of horizontal, this is our best case scenario for offense, when all of these defenders are going, okay, I'm just going to stay super tight and I'm going to stay on the open side, and my job is just to take away the open side. But I'm sure most of us know that's generally not what happens. Players are going to go and poach off in the space. They're going to try and mess stuff around. Generally in vert, you'll actually have someone go and stand on the break side to take stuff away. People are going to give themselves an advantage, and they're going to go and stand in this active space that we're looking for. And similarly with 3-4, they will bracket in different areas to try and take those areas away. So the first thing we can do to help stop that is to adapt the structure. So at the moment, vert stack, we have two similar channels, but as we mentioned before, this channel is quite difficult to hit because of the stack in the way, because of the force. And so that has, over time, become a side stack. Now we have taken away the two sectors on the left, but because they're more difficult to hit, we don't mind that as much. So we've now increased the area of the field. We now have 4 completely free sectors to move into. Now this is really simplifying it, and I'm sure all of you will have played side stack, but this is the general idea of how we're going to create more space for our receivers. Instead of a vert stack, we've moved everyone over to the side. Now we have a huge 4-sector active space for people to run into. It makes our cutters' lives much easier because they have more space. It makes our throwers' lives much easier because they have more space to throw into. And more importantly, I think it makes our defenders' lives much more difficult because they now have a much larger area to try and defend. With a horizontal stack, over time, we've now seen the introduction of split stack. So we've taken away those two guys from the middle, those two players from the middle, and we've now got an entire sector in the middle and 3 deep sectors still available for people to cut into. Because as we look on this side, whilst this big undersection here is useful to hit, the very edges of these sectors are probably where it's going to start to get more difficult. So if I could color grade this, the middle would probably be green, and as we start to get towards the edges, that's probably when it's going to start to get more amber in terms of what is a higher versus lower value option. We would really like to catch the disc in the middle of the field. So moving these 2 players out, we've now created a huge central area for our receivers to cut into and to make it much easier for our throwers to throw into. All make sense so far? Awesome. Now, the second way that we can look to utilize this space is the introduction of pull plays. And we're going to see that across vert, horizontal, split, side stack, any number of different things. So when this vert stack pull play begins, I want you to try and guess who the active cutter that we've nominated is going to be. And I'm going to pause it just as the disc is about to come into play. So we'll pause that there. So if we take a look at the vert stack here, very similar vert setup to what we showed in the very first photo, except we do have someone out in the lane at the moment to go and engage a defender. Everyone else is just in a perfect vertical stack. Now, we've already seen, but when I look at this from a completely outside view, I don't think this guy right in the middle of the field is going to be our active cutter. Generally, we're looking for the person who's out in the lane or maybe the back of stack. What we see here is GB are going to clear out that deep cutter right here. He's going to open up what the venue has very kindly already sectioned out for us, a huge sector here. We're going to see the rest of our cutters clear to the far side of the field. 1, 2, and 3 are going to clear to the inactive sector, and that gives our undercutter lots of space to come underneath. Now, had we just set up in a regular vert stack and had our receiver here just setting up in the lane, defenses are probably going, cool, he's the one that we need to mark, he's probably active, we can bracket, and we have 4 very inactive people on the far side of the field. Instead of that, we create multiple options, and we also create a system where we have 3 people actively clearing to the inactive, less value side of the field to provide a good underneath option. We'll see it again. Now, ideally then, this huge space that's been created in front of the receiver, we then have that for a continuation afterwards. So this is what generally a side stack will look like from a defensive standpoint. So whilst we have created this huge open space for people to move into, defenses are going to start to adapt. As I said, they're going to go and move into that space, and suddenly just running into that huge active space that we created is no longer so easy. So this is the example that we saw there. We had 3 or 4 players clearing into the inactive side of the field, and that's given one of our players a slash under on the other side. What can we see other than the position of the players, the difference between the two images here? So we have the first one, I'll give you a clue. We've seen the disc move to the middle. Yep, Ben? Was that your one? That is one. And the other. It's big, round, and green. Yeah? The active space is strange. Exactly. So as we've seen the disc move to the middle of the field, and our players have slashed across to the inactive side, our inactive side has moved from the right, on the left photo, to the left on this photo. So something really important to recognize is that the active space will continue to change throughout a point depending on the position of the disc. So as the disc moves to the middle, suddenly our active side becomes the other side of the field. For me, generally, we want to continue the disc into the side of the field where it's just moved. So moving it from the right to the middle, I then want to move the disc from the middle to the left. We want to continue in that sort of motion. Here's an example of how defenses are generally going to try and set up to bracket a horizontal stack. So what we'll often see is this person here is actually marking a handler. So they would be what's called a sag in some instances. They're going to go and stand in the middle of the field, and they're going to say, I don't care if you throw a lateral swing, because I'm just going to go and stop any upfield options. Them doing so means that this person can come and peel off the back to stop any deep shots, and our other 3 defenders are all staying tight. One way we can look to try and prevent this is by getting these 3 receivers clearing upfield and slashing from the right-hand side. Again, a very typical pool play that lots of teams are going to run in 3-4. And them doing so creates a much wider, much bigger underspace for us to hit into. And also, this deep shot then becomes a genuine option as well. What we might do here is actually notice that this defender is peeled off. And so actually, this offensive player now becomes our slash. They're going to be the player that's going to come underneath because they've realized that the defense is set up in that way. The important thing here is that we haven't really reduced any space, active space in the deep area, but we've increased our active space in the under. Another thing that's important here is that we only have one cutter actually genuinely active. So we're going to talk a little bit about in a bit the pros and cons of pool plays and how we can take that into our organic play. Having a single cutter be the person that we know is wanting the disc allows everyone else to just do whatever they can to get that person the Frisbee. Next slide, we're going to ask you who has initiated this next pool play. So we're going to watch it through in full.
That's going to be an awkward ball to field. Hillman stops the roll and spreads the lead.
And we get a nice underneath. So who initiated the pool play? Joel. Nice, yeah. So what we see is, we call this a power play. Going back again. We call this a power play where in 3-4, if we go back to the last slide, in 3-4, one way to make this cut much easier is to open up the space to stop in the handler area to stop these players being able to sag into the space. And so we will see Abrams run an aggressive handler movement from here. So as James is catching the disc here, we see Abrams has already started his power play across the field. And number 33, who is defending him, his job as a handler defender for the first 4-5 seconds of a stall, often straight after a pull, is I'm going to stop any downfield movement. Again, I don't care if you swing the disc laterally to another handler. We want to stop your pull play. We want to stop you gaining any big yards immediately off the pull. The power play allows us to engage that defender and get him out of the space. If he doesn't pick up Tom here and decides to stay in the lane, we will hit him in the middle of the field. We will absolutely take a 5 or 6 yard immediate gainer to the middle of the field in a power position, especially for someone like Abrams, who, if you don't know, is great at hooking. We want him in those power positions. What happens is 33 stays with him instead. And because he stays with him, we're now opening up all this active space for Justin to come under, and get a nice gainer to finish the pool play. And notice again on both of those pool plays that we've had so far, after the receiver has caught the disc, when they've turned around and look upfield, there is a huge space in front of them because the active space has been filled by Justin, but then that active space is then just shifted forward slightly. So he now has a huge active space in front of him to continue into. What's not happened is lots of people coming across to try and get the disc, so when one of them catches it, they're just staring at a bunch of people in front. He's looking into lots of space that someone can then cut into. So this is what we see here. So this is our power play movement spreading across the field, and now we have 2, even 3 huge sectors for Justin to run into. If his defender does try to take away the under by biting on the underneath, there's a big deep space for him to move into. And as I said, if the number 33 defender here decides to stay in the lane and stop that, we have a really good power position play to the middle of the field for our receiver. Cool. So question for all of you, and we touched on it a little bit already, but why do pool plays work so well? Why do so many teams use them, and why do they generally come off most of the time? Yes. Sorry, going to grab a microphone.
Maybe because the defenders are not ready because they are coming downfield. So if we instantly pull out our pull play, it's difficult for them to react to it.
Yep, it can catch them off guard. And part of the reason it catches them off guard is because there are a number of things the offense can be doing in that moment. There are multiple options that they have to try and stop. It's really good. Anyone else? Yep.
Also because like everyone on the offense knows exactly what's happening, so no one is like blocking space up or anything.
Yep. Everyone's on exactly the same page. If you've run your pool plays enough, if you've read the playbook enough, and if you've rehearsed, everyone knows exactly where everyone is going. There will be slight variations depending on the defense, but ideally everyone is on exactly the same page. And anyone else? Yep.
Yeah, if it goes well, it starts to flow for the offense.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of, and I think it probably continues on from everyone being on the same page, is that once we complete that pool play, usually for a good high value option, there is something that is then continuing off that. Like the pool play is usually the initial movement, but there is always a continuation option afterwards. So what I've got here is everyone is on the same page. The defense, as you said, has to respect multiple options, and as you said, there are multiple high value options throughout the pool play as well. Now, clearing is something that has probably quite a negative connotation to it, I think, in Ultimate. Everyone has experience of maybe dancing around a little bit in the lane and their coach or someone on the sideline screaming at them to get out, to go deep, to get out of the way, to clear, whatever it may be. Clearing is a very positive thing in high-level Ultimate. We need to be able to be very selfless in our movements and in the way that we play, to be able to provide space for other people on the field. When I talk about high value versus low value options, we're not always going to have high value options just from organic play if we are all trying to get the disc. There are going to be people on the field who are able to get higher value receiving options than others. And so we need to be able to, in the moment, determine, am I the person who is going to provide a high value option now? Or am I the person that needs to clear get out of the space and allow them to come in. So clearing allows us to take those principles of the pool play that we talked about and implement them into organic play. So knowing that everyone's on the same page, providing multiple high-level, high-value options, and keeping the defense honest. That's the most important thing I think about clearing as a positive thing rather than the negative connotation, is that clearing is providing an option elsewhere whilst also providing space for the option that we are actually really looking for, but in a way that means the defenses have to go and respect both. Cool. So based on this still, we have Lexi, one of our D-line handlers, on the disc on the right-hand side of the field. We currently have 3 people in front of him, and we kind of have a weird spread 4-person handler set. Would anyone like to, on the off chance of shaming themselves in front of everyone, give a guess at who is going to get the disc in this clip going forward? I'll give you a clue. It's an upfield progression type movement. It's not just a little reset. Yes? Person first in the stack. This person? Yeah. Okay. Anyone else want to give it a go as well? Yeah.
Far side end zone.
This person? Yeah.
One of these two.
One of these two. Okay, cool. Let's watch it through. Nice. Very good. Now, absolutely no shame in your answer whatsoever, okay? So that's the important thing to recognize here, is that the reason that was so difficult to tell who was getting the disc is because we're following through with those principles, right? We are providing multiple high-value options, and we are making the defense have to be honest. You're absolutely right. If we go back, there we go. He could have absolutely done something in the space and maybe got a break into the middle of the field. One of these two guys could have run a pepper mill type shape and then gotten under. Our reset here could have even cleared up the line. Generally, GB Open's principles at the moment is if you are in front of the disc, get away from being in front of the disc. Be that either by these two players going deep, or this player realizing he's just kind of in no man's land in the middle of the field, is going to clear back wide. Doing so allows Henry here to recognize, I now have all this space for this big lateral cut across the field. So we're going to see the 2, 3, 4 cutters in front of the disc go deep, just a few steps. Andrew is clearing back wide. And now we go from being fairly static in front of our own end zone line to receiving a 10-yard gainer on a completely free pass to one of our receivers. So we'll see that here. So our active space is in front of the disc and this deep option here. We have 2 receivers moving deep to clear that space. We have our handler who has found himself in the middle of the field getting back wide, and that's allowing Henry to come and now attack this big active space. And this is the important part to this, that we have created through clearing. So it's not taking advantage of the space that happens to be there at that time. It's what can we do to create better, high-value active space, which is what we've done with those 3 clearing cuts. Cool. So this next clip, it's a slightly more handler-dominator type clip, but I want you to take note of how many of the passes that we complete are available because of clearing cuts.
McHale goes wide to Hillman. Canada forcing a much slower possession from Great Britain. Hillman to McHale in the red zone now. Can he find the window through
There we go.
the line to
So we're going to watch that back, and I'm going to talk through it bit by bit. So initially, slashing across the field, We notice there, I've looked in field straight away, so Justin has cleared up the line to allow this first pass. James has then stayed very wide with his clear to allow Justin to get that inside. We now have a break-up field because our receivers are going to clear out of the way into the end zone. And we have Hillman actually clearing laterally across the field to give Justin space for the upline. So lots of movements there that were, I am not trying to get to the Frisbee. I am trying to get out of the way because I can see that these handlers at the moment are in flow. They are aggressively attacking up the line. They have huge space in front of them. And we have 3 world-class throwers who are able to hit each other in those spaces with no problem whatsoever, as long as we have that space available for them. Again, not space that just happens to be there, have space that we are creating with our movements. Does that all make sense? Cool. So key takeaways with active space creating. We need to think about why pool plays are so effective, those principles that we talked about. Everyone is on the same page. We know exactly who is going to be active in that space, creating high-value options for our throwers, and making sure that our defense that we are playing against has to be completely honest. Can we implement that into our organic offense? So that first clip that we looked at with those 2 deep receivers going clear and allowing Henry to slash across the field, that is basically that first horizontal pull play that we looked at with 3 receivers going deep and 1 person slashing across. But we do that in our organic play because we know that it is effective. We know as a pull play it works really well, so why not do it in open organic play? This is probably one of the most important ones going into the rest of the weekend, rest of the week and the weekend, especially as we go back into mixed later on in the week. Just because you're free, should you be getting the disc? And it links to this bottom one, high value, how high value is the option I'm creating? Is another option higher value? So this is basically answered by this one. If you're getting the disc at stall 8 or stall 9 for a 2-yard reset because we need to get the stall down to 0, fine. If the stall is at 0 and you're going to go and provide a 5-meter under on the sideline, on the open side, there was probably a number of higher value options that we could have been creating. So as we go into the rest of the week, have a think about the position that you're currently in, have a think about the position that you're going to end up getting the disc, and think, how can I create a better active space for us to get higher value options? Usually from someone maybe at the back of stack if you're playing a vert, maybe from a handler dominator slash up the line, often from a female matching player who has set up a cut in the vert stack that we don't notice, or we think, oh, that's way too late in the stall, or whatever it is often the case in mixed as well. So really, really important for us to be able to take that into consideration going into the rest of the week. Cool. Does anyone have any questions about that section before we move into the next? Nope. Excellent. Means I did a good job. Cool. So when we create these active shapes, how are we going to hit them? Now, I mentioned in the clip that we watched with the handler dominator set, we had 3 world-class throwers being able to hit those spaces to those receivers. However, one thing that Andy, Justin, and I wouldn't be classed as is traditional throwers. We have all worked on our skill to the point that we can hit options that wouldn't necessarily usually be available, not because we have developed a crazy difficult skill or worked on a super hard to do low release, off pivot, air bounce backhand, just because we've broken away slightly from the traditional sense of how we need to get the disc to the receiver. So question for the group, what is IO in your perspective? Don't overthink it, just like if someone said throw an IO, what would you do? Hands up, hands up, hands up. If someone said throw an IO, what would it be? Yes, at the back.
I mean, just typical, like with the noise pointing up, so we can, like balance it out. I don't know.
Yep. And is there any particular way that you would tend to throw an IO?
Yeah, like with the disc shape, like kind of nose down, I guess you would say. So it can go up and then balance itself. That would be like my interpretation of the IO, or also just the space you're throwing into.
Okay. So the space that you're throwing into is probably the interesting part that I want to talk about. So when someone says to me, throw it with IO, the only thing that I am thinking about is the angle of the disc, that first point that you touched on. Anything else to do with the throw, when someone says IO, irrelevant. IO to me is just the angle of the disc. So IO being, like you say, with the edge of the disc pointing down towards the ground, the opposite being roll curve. So being able to categorize and identify our throws is going to allow us to allocate them to different situations. So a lot of the time when someone says, do you have an IO break? To me, that's such a broad question, right? Like there are so many nuances and so many different types of IO break. To me, a break is a break of the mark, and an IO is an angle of the disc. So to me, we are missing a number of different categories that we can have within that. I think the main one usually is that IO is kind of an inside IO behind the mark. But to me also, you can throw IO on and around if you don't want it to roll quite as much. Or if you want to roll it more, you put less IO on it. So you can still throw an around backhand with IO. So that is one part of the throw. So all of these things are things I take into account when I am throwing to a receiver. So we've obviously already spoken about IO. Literally just the angle of the disc. Roll curve, just the angle of the disc. Am I throwing inside or around? So am I attacking the inside of my force, or am I stepping out to throw an around throw? Is that going to be high release or low release? Am I doing a full pivot, or am I throwing it on the off pivot with my foot off the ground? How much touch or speed am I going to put on that throw? So when someone says, can you throw an IO break? I want your question to be, tell me more. What do you want from my IO break? Do you want a low release, touchy, full pivot backhand IO? Or do you want an off pivot, high release, inside IO backhand break? Completely different throws that often get grouped into the same sort of category. So point one we're going to touch on is touch. So a very, very simple diagram here. If you start playing Ultimate anywhere, you get taught you cut out from a stack, you throw the disc flat, and you try and meet them to hit them in the chest, right? Everything is hit them in the breadbasket, hit them in the chest so they can clap catch. What can people notice about the receiving point here between where the disc is going to where the receiver is catching? Yes? Ooh.
The disc is kind of coming from the side, the running player.
And the point itself, anything about that? Yep.
It's a very precise point.
It's very precise, yeah. It's quite a specific and it's quite small area that we are trying to hit into, which is a very valid point when the disc is coming from the side, because if this isn't quite right, we don't have a lot of margin for error. So we have an example here, basically of this exact same thing. I have the disc on this close side of the field, and we have Andrew cutting out from a hander position. Based on that diagram that we just looked at, or based on what is taught traditionally, I throw a straight line straight to Andrew here for him to run onto in this space. Let's take a look at what actually happens. Okay. So what we see is actually the mark is now reacting back to get onto the force side. So this is actually a break side throw. And we also see that Andy isn't necessarily sprinting under to get the disc for me to hit him straight in the chest. So we're going to watch that again. So instead of me hitting him directly, I notice that the force is coming along. And Andy instead is kind of stepping away from me slightly. And he has got eye contact with me the entire time. His mark is behind him, and he's kind of just stepping away. Now because of that, I know he wants a thrower-led throw out into the space. And what I'm doing is increasing what I call the receiver sphere. Now, on that first diagram, The sphere is very small. This is basically the only area that the receiver can catch the disc based on this type of throw, based on a flat, fairly fast, not very touchy throw. That's the only space that they can receive it. By increasing the receiver sphere, I'm increasing the area of the field in which they can catch the disc. So we see here, as the disc goes up, there is now an entire flight, mid-flight and late flight, that Andy can go and catch the disc. So why don't we always just throw direct to the chest? Because of that variance, because of that margin for error. So if my throw isn't quite right, like in these two examples here, both of these are misses. Okay? Either I've put it too far out in front, or maybe my angle wasn't quite right. I've put it behind and the defender has managed to come through and get a block. All of that comes because my receiving point is so small. What I'm looking to create is a receiving sphere where, as I throw it with touch, like I said, I'm creating a large area of the field that I know my receiver can go and still catch the disc, regardless of the slight margin for error there. Making sure that it's out in front still, so my receiver doesn't get overtaken by a defender or it's not behind. But that margin for error that we talked about earlier is now still landing in my receiver sphere. So if I throw it with a little bit too much roll, or it's a little too fast, because I've done it with a throw that is increasing that sphere, those margin for errors disappear. So often people will look at some of the throws I do and go, oh, that was ridiculous, how did the receiver get that? But it's because my receivers know that I am very happy to put the disc out into space with enough touch that they can just go and run onto it afterwards. Here's another example we're going to see here from the Madrid Ultimate Cup. So this throw to Will is basically impossible to hit in the chest. And so as the disc is in the air, if I can manage to pause it in time, there we go. So I've now created a receiving sphere probably 15 to 20 feet in all areas of that side of the end zone, okay? Now, that comes from throwing with a lot of touch, throwing very nose up, trusting again that Will knows that this is going to be a thrower-led throw. But if I try and throw an around bladey flick to him here to hit him in the chest, much smaller margins for error, much more difficult to execute. And like I say, if something isn't quite right, it's probably a turnover. This was one of the most nonchalant throws that I put out, and people were saying that was ridiculous, like surely that was going to be a turnover. I know, regardless of how that disc flies, after the first third of the flight, I know if it's going to be a goal or not, because I've created the receiving sphere for him to go and run onto and get. And again, if that pops up a bit too high, he's got a yard on his receiver, Will's a big lad. If it's a little bit too low, he's strolling onto this, okay? And so that's because of that sphere that's been created. So as we see here, this is the sphere that's been created with the throw. This is the point that he's actually caught it. But again, any of these positions, he could have gone and caught the disc. So any ideas why we don't always just throw these super large receiver sphere, floaty, touchy shots? Yes, let's get the mic to you. Could pass the mic to the back for me.
If you're throwing to someone who's cutting under and they have someone like relatively near their back, or if you're throwing to someone who's standing in space, like they're being poached off in a zone and you don't want someone to be able to come into it.
Exactly right. The bane of all O-lines and throwers everywhere, poached defenders. So ideally, with creating these spheres, we are putting it in a way that the person who is playing match on our player isn't going to get there. I've created a sphere there that is completely ahead of Will and completely ahead of his defender. I know that Will is never getting overtaken in that space to the disc. But if we were playing zone, and I see that Will is completely stood very free, but there's someone maybe nearby, perhaps I need to increase the speed of the throw and reduce the touch to get the disc to him quicker. So as you see here, the larger this throwing sphere becomes, the larger the area is that a poach defender can come in and maybe get a block. So there are going to be situations where we need that throwing sphere to be smaller and to be more precise to stop that from happening. So a lot of the really quick throws that you see a lot of the top throwers use that are hitting people directly in the chest are because they've really honed their craft and because they've reduced their margin for error through practice. And because of that, it's much harder for the person who's marking them and poach defenders to go in and get involved. Something to think about when we go into playing mixed, again, is that generally male matching players will be looking for these poach blocks quite often. So whilst we want to try and hit our female matching receivers with touch, we also need to be aware that there are going to be male matching players roaming around looking to try and get those blocks. Cool. So we've talked about expanding that receiving sphere to make things as easy as possible by using touch. We can also use touch to expand our throwing range and throwing ability with those throwing spheres. So this is going to be a bit of audience participation again. So in these throws that we've talked about so far, there are what I would call the traditional ideas of how we get the disc to a receiver. And generally, that is if Will is cutting in this direction, I want the disc to be traveling to meet him. I want the disc to be going towards him in this sort of pattern to meet him in the middle of the field. That way I know the disc is going towards him and it's not going to go too far. Would anyone like to give me an idea of what they think the traditional throw for this would be? Scuba? Generally no. But righty scuba here is a throw that if you throw it flat into IO is then coming back into the receiver. I like it. If you don't have that, or if you're slightly less expansive, yeah.
I mean, if it's a lefty, I would turn inside out forehand.
Okay.
To the space.
With IO.
Yeah.
Yep. And if you were righty.
Righty. I mean, you could do the same, but it's become more popular to do the opposite these past few years.
The round flick.
No, the backhand outside in instead.
But we're talking traditional. If we're talking like old school traditional throwing.
Inside out or the flick around.
Okay. So if we're looking to try and meet the person in the same space, we're either throwing for a righty here an IO backhand because that IO angle is coming back into you to meet him, or we're looking for that around righty flick. For me as a lefty, I could have thrown an around lefty backhand because again, we're meeting in a single point. So generally we're looking for this kind of shape, the disc traveling from right to left and Will traveling from left to right to meet in the middle. So let's see what actually happens. So instead of that, we have a disc that travels with roll curve for the entirety of the flight. So in most textbooks, most ultimate teachings early on, if you're seeing this, you're told you have to get IO on the disc. You have to get the disc in a way that it's flying back in towards your receiver. If I was a more traditional thrower, I could maybe pivot out really far and try and get loads of IO angle on the disc to get it traveling back in towards Will. But first of all, I know that Will is a fast receiver. I know that I am throwing with enough touch to create a large receiving sphere. And I know that I have worked on my touch roll curve forehand to the point where I can put it on a steep angle and I know how long the disc is going to stay in the air for him to get onto. Another one here. So we have myself on the left side of the disc, left side of the field with disc. This receiver won't be catching it. It is this receiver here. So if I'm throwing a huck to this receiver, what sort of shape are we, again, traditionally looking for? Scuba. What sort of space are we traditionally going to be looking at here? And this is a lefty, or if you were a righty, throwing a flick in that same position as well.
To the farthest side of the field.
To the farthest side of the field. So probably aiming for somewhere in here. Yeah. And what sort of shape are you looking to put on the disc? IO? Yeah. So lots of this for the camera. Lots of this. So Flick IO for the righties, for the lefties again, inside IO backhand. Cool. Again, what would traditionally be taught. We're looking for an IO sort of shape to this sort of the side of the field. It's what we'd call the break side as well, so it's getting it away from this receiver. Let's see how it played out. So instead of that, we have a completely roll curve flight pretty much the entire way. So I can recognize here that whilst this side of the field is away from the defender, we're also getting into a much smaller receiving sphere, okay? The more I'm pushing it towards this sideline, the smaller the area is that the receiver can actually catch the disc. So again, I'm very comfortable knowing that I can throw a disc with roll curve and be traveling away from my receiver, but I've done so in a way that creates this huge receiving sphere for them to run onto. So even from this position, I'm very happy with the disc traveling away from him. So the disc is basically going to be released flat. And we have a roll curve flight the entire way through. Cool. Next one. So this is a bit more difficult to see, but we have myself on the sideline, right on the sideline here. Number 31 is going to be receiving. He's probably 5 meters away or so from the sideline. So generally, the two options are going to be either I'm throwing a flick break around into the far side of the end zone, could be a righty hammer, could be a backhand straight down to the line into this space. We'll notice that the backhand down the line space, this receiving sphere, is much smaller, not necessarily because of the throw that I'm using, but just because of the space next to the sideline. So that, for me, rules that out. So we have a much bigger receiving active space area on the other side of the field. So receive the disc here. And so instead of that, because again, I know that I trust my backhand roll curve enough that we're going to be pushing it to the break side of the field towards the far side of the end zone, just using that very regular step out roll curve backhand. Okay? So we're breaking away from those norms and those traditional shapes. The reason I'm able to do so is because I've been able to practice using those different angles of the disc, not only on IO or roll curve, but also the pitch of the nose as well. If I'm putting something nose up versus nose down, I'm able to have the disc in an area, in that sphere that a receiver can catch for a longer period of time, and it really opens up those available options. So key takeaways. Having the disc to meet the receiver is important. We talked about sometimes we have to hit the receiver in the chest. Generally, those faster receiving shots hitting them directly into the breadbasket are going to be those more traditional meeting at an angle, but it's not mandatory. So next time you're out maybe throwing an inside backhand, see if you can do it with roll curve. See how long you can keep the disc in the air on a steep roll curve angle. So practice those. Practice with someone in the park. Get them to stand 5 meters away to your left, and instead of throwing an IO throw or a flat throw, can you roll curve it across your body to them, and vice versa on the flick side? And then where is the safest space to receive the disc away from the defender? So when we create these throwing spheres, we need to make sure that the very edge of the throwing sphere is nowhere that a defender can get it. As soon as the throwing sphere includes space that defenders can get into, that's when we're going to start having blocks from the person who's actually marking up, and also from those post defenders as well. That's everything. Thanks so much. So Ideally, any questions would be towards what we've done so far first. We'll get those out of the way, and then if anyone wants to ask any more general questions, they're obviously more than welcome to do so as well. So anything about the space creating or throwing or any personal experience or team experience, please. And we'll make sure we get the mic to you as well.
So you've talked about, throwing away, putting the edge away from your receiver. I've also heard some people talk about a fade in those such throws. So you throw with for example, you call it a roll curve?
Or OI, yep.
OI curve, and then the idea is to, at the end of the throw, it flattens out so it doesn't necessarily get away from your receiver anymore. It's just, normal clap catch. How are you?
Great question. So can I get a number of hands of people who've played disc golf before? Good number. So anyone who's played disc golf will know that discs mechanically and aerodynamically always want to finish on that type of fade. Ultra stars are what we would class as being understable. So when you throw it, you don't need to put a lot of power or speed into an ultra star to get it to go very flat or to get it to turn. You can manipulate an ultra star in the same way that you do a disc golf disc to get that late fade. And a lot of it comes from the manipulation of the nose angle. So if you throw a roll curve like an indoors throw, like a blade, you're never going to see that pan out because you're throwing with a bit more spin, a bit more power, and you're also throwing fairly nose down. So there isn't as much time for the air to get under the disc and flatten it out. As soon as you start to throw a little bit more nose up, like those touchy inside backhands, for example, you're going to start to see, even when you throw it on roll curve, you're going to get that flattening out at the end. So with the one that I threw to Andy in the game against France, very much roll curve out of the hand, and then by the time he receives it, it's completely flat. A lot of that comes from tilting the nose up very slightly, so we see it go up, but then it's panning out towards the end. So if you get a chance to play any disc golf, would highly recommend it to improve your understanding of disc mechanics and the way that they fly. And then bringing that back to an ultra star, you'll start to realize how you can manipulate that as well. But yeah, general easier answer is try tilting that nose up slightly and see if you can get that to then pan out at the end. Cool. We had someone, did we have someone over here? No? Someone here? Yep.
Wouldn't it kind of negate the outside in if there's wind? Because it would either be pushed down or blown over?
Good question. So for me, the crosswind is going to impact how wide I need to make my throw rather than whether or not I want to throw it. So as someone who is trying to become one of the best throwers in the world, I never really want to be in a position where a crosswind is stopping me throwing an around backhand. What it might do is I actually throw it flatter because the wind is going to move it on its own without me needing as much angle. I might put it wider because I know that the wind is going to bring it across itself. Pulling is a great example of if you have a huge crosswind on a pull, you don't choose to throw a flick pull instead. You still throw a backhand pull, but you might adjust your angle of release. You might adjust the angle of the disc when you release it. I think the main point, going forward for people going away and practicing is that if you decide to go out and throw and it's windy, make sure you are practicing those slightly more difficult options in those conditions. If you see it's wet and rainy and windy outside, go and throw, go and do it anyway. If you see that it's a rushing crosswind, don't just stand up and downwind and practice your downwind and upwind throws. Get into that position where you're having to throw that around backhand with a rushing crosswind, and you'll start to realize the adjustments that you can make to have the outcome of the throw be the same despite the conditions being different. Cool. Yep. Well, let's get the mic to you.
Can you also talk about how like tailwind and headwind impacts your game?
Good question. Yeah. So again, disc golf is a really good, helpful piece of info on that. So for me, other than that point I just mentioned about going out and practicing it, that understanding of the mechanics of how the disc will, what we would call flip in disc golf, in different conditions is really important. So The reason why it is much more difficult to throw in wind usually is because the wind wants to turn the disc over. So you try and throw with IO and it flips into a roll curve. That's impacted by the speed that you're throwing. It's massively impacted by the revolutions that you're putting on the disc itself. It's also very much impacted by how that nose angle again, how much air is being shown to the underside of the disc. So generally, you are taught in wind, you've got to get really low when you release. I think the reason for that is because most people still throw slightly nose up to get the disc to fly. And so when you throw low and nose up, it then rises to a normal height. However, if you throw in wind and you throw very nose down or very flat, you can do that from chest height, because the nose angle being down is going to stop that wind getting underneath. So rather than seeing it as an upwind approach of being low, think of it as how can I manipulate the nose angle to stop the wind being able to take it away. So you should still, ideally, in upwind conditions, still be able to throw high releases, as long as you are angling the nose of the disc in a way that it's not going to be impacted by the wind quite as much. Downwind is generally going to be less impactful. I think what you will see a lot more with downwind is people taking those very direct options that we talked about with a very specific receiving sphere. Because like, well, I can feel the wind in my back. I know that the disc is going to come out on the angle that I want, and maybe not compensating for the fact that it is just going to travel faster because of that. It is a very different type of touch because the wind generally wants to push the disc down when you pop the nose up. So actually having a slightly mid to higher release in strong tailwinds can be really useful, because it's much harder to throw with the nose down to complete that than it is to throw with the nose up. So actually bringing the disc up but keeping the nose flat to up will help keep the disc in the air. Cool. Next up. Yep. We have another mic here as well if we need to use that. Thank you, GMAT.
Okay, so just in like creating space, like how do you feel about like how many points out of a full game of offense do you throw a pull play out there? Like how many do you have available?
Mm-hmm.
Like is it just, or do you just go out and do the normal system?
We as Clapham or GB Open will run a pull play every single offensive point. So we will have usually 3 or 4 different ones that we can rotate across. They will differ from 3-4 to split stack to vert stack to side stack, and we will never do the same one back to back generally, unless we haven't been able to actually achieve it. If the handler sags went into the lane and we didn't actually get to do the pull play, then we'll try and run it again. But yeah, generally we'll have one every single time. I think we're probably going to reach a point in Ultimate where that is the standard, where American football is a great example of how you don't just go out and go, cool, let's see how the middle guys do in the middle of the field, right? They have very set, distinct plays that everyone knows, that there's been huge controversy around from other teams stealing them, right? Because they're so impactful. So I think advice would be, if you were looking to implement it with your team, is make sure you have a variety. Make sure that they work in a way that if a defense tries to stop one of them, that the next pull play that you have takes advantage of that quite a bit. So we have a couple of vert pull players that has one player just clearing deep to allow space for the under. And so if defenses decide to go full send on unders, we have another one where we slash to one side of the field and someone is aggressively attacking deep. But they look very similar initially. So ideally, we're having situations where the defense go, oh, I know what this pull play is. I'm going to full send on this under because I know this is the guy. And actually, it's a completely different pull play that we've set up that attacks a different side of the field.
Follow up, like how many of those pull plays can be like adjusted like with a certain condition? Like, okay, so you have this vertical set and you're trying to hit this guy, but if there's a poach there, do you have like an answer within the play to go to somewhere else? Or if it's just blocked, we'll just do something else and just revert back to the system?
We'll usually have a plan B, and it will be a plan B that is pull play specific. So if we know that this person in the pool play is being fronted, is being fully sent, no wonder, then we will make sure that they go deep, and we will have, say, the next person in the stack. If that happens, we know that you are going here. So that's kind of like an extra section to that pool play. But then more organically, we know what we are doing if the pool play doesn't come off. Whether that be is we always try and recognize that within, say, 2 or 3 seconds of the stall, and we're running an early reset, or we're going up the line to have a fill from somewhere else. And that's more of a general principle, organic thing that we would do as opposed to a set part of the pool play. But that's in addition to the set kind of next step to the pool play if we need to. And sometimes it's not going to work, and you have to be able to adapt and go into organic. But a lot of the time, if the pool plays don't work, it's because the defenses have done something to stop it, which means there's probably more space elsewhere for us to take advantage of that. Anyone else? A couple more? Yeah. Yes. There you go.
So generally in the organic play, there is more chaos, obviously. So if there is a situation that I am an inactive player right now, and I am being poached off, but I don't really see the space to attack just to involve my player. So for example, I can go deep, someone wants to go deep. How can I involve the player without taking the active space? Because I feel like he won't bite on me attacking inactive space, and he will be still poaching. And
yep, good question. So if we go back to just a 3-4 setup. Okay, let's use this as an example. So what we'll often see, to your point, is one of these defenders kind of peeling off the back, and we have one of our wide offensive players then kind of stood on the sideline, and their defenders just disappeared. If anyone follows the AU coaching Instagram, I just did a piece on Ben Powley getting a big block on a deep shot for the same reason. His offensive player stands on the sideline, they're very inactive, which is good. They have been told to hold space, but because of that, he's peeled and he's gone and got a poach block on the deep shot. We've come across this a lot ourselves, and for us, it's about being able to threaten that you are going to be active without necessarily doing it. So even if that is taking 2 or 3 hard steps in either direction every few seconds just to keep them honest, generally what we will try and do is, if we ignore this defender here and say that they've gone up into this poach spot, we will try and actually have them come much shallower. If we were to think about this as organic play, us getting the disc on an under from one of these middle people into this sector is usually a good success. We've done well. So why not just have this person just come and stand here and receive a completely free swing in the underspace? Or maybe they do a cycle with this handler and they come and cycle through and they do something like this. One of 2 things will probably happen. You'll probably either have this defender notice that you're completely free for a yard gaining throw to the sideline, and they'll come and snap back onto you, at which point you've done your job, you've kept that area clear. Or they don't, and you get a completely free pass. Or they switch. And that's what this handler cycle is really useful to do, because this person will have a defender, they'll be communicating with this defender, and they say, well, we need to sort something out. But this person can't mark 2 people. So generally coming shallow on the sideline and just providing an option is great, because we want our throwers to recognize that there is a deep poach. We'll swing the disc and suddenly we have gained 10, 15 yards from all you doing, just going, okay, my guy's going over there, I'm just going to come under and I'm going to offer something. And often being really loud and vocal of that as well, and saying, I'm completely free, I'm poached. Just coming into that space will get them to come and snap back onto you too. You have a comment?
So first of all, thanks for the presentation. I agree with everything. We've had a really similar talk in our team. Also, even though we're very different throwers, I would say, we're still very untraditional in some sense, I would say. Just a comment. You don't always have to just think about your guy, because he's already had the decision made that he's gonna go. But you want to provoke other people on the field to make difficult decisions as well. So if you're deciding to go, like Connor said, into the space where you might be receiving a free swing pass, maybe one of the other defenders has to make the difficult decision, do I allow that or not? Right? So it's not always the guy peeling off that you want to force into making a decision, but any defensive player. And just like on defense, you want to force a lot of decisions made by the offense. It's the same for the offense. You want to force each defender to make multiple decisions, and one of them is going to mess up. And then you have an open person.
Yeah. And even the force will have to do something different, right? We're talking about other defenders upfield, but as a force, if you see that they've just swung the disc and there is someone completely free for a continuation, you might then have to try and sag off to stop that, and suddenly the thrower is stood there with no force, no mark, and they can throw and go to the races, something like that. Joel? Yeah. Oh, okay, can we got a mic down there? Yeah, thank you.
So, I think about when throwing angles, going back to the topic of throwing angles, I think a lot of times in drills, it's kind of easier to practice them because you can kind of set up the way you want to throw them, you visualize beforehand. But in game, there's many situations where you're coming from an awkward position. Maybe you try to throw and the mark was there, and then you have to recover to do another throw. So I kind of want to ask you if you have any tips on how to move the disc in your hands, like where to move it, and how to get you're able to recover from a position and still get out a difficult angle throw, because I think a lot of people will, I don't know, pivot to the backhand and then throw with a lot of bounce because that's the only thing left they can control, but not the actual angle.
Yeah, good question. So I don't want to talk necessarily about the specifics and the technical part of that, because I think that is going to differ for everyone. There are multiple world-class throwers, even here this weekend, who all throw very differently, but can still do the things that I've been talking about today. So I wouldn't want to touch on like necessarily the grip or the angle in that way. But I think the important thing is being able to implement those changes or that approach early on in the development or early on in your season or just in your practice. The way I view it is like a photo album, and each page is a different section of my game, and within the album there are chapters for training, and there are chapters for scrimmaging, and there are chapters for pickup, and there are chapters for tournaments, there are chapters for elite tournaments, there are chapters for elite tournaments in knockout, there are chapters for elite tournaments in medal games, right? Every single thing that I do differs depending on where on the photo album it is. And every time I learn something new or develop a new part of my game, it adds a photo into the album. Every then slight variation on that thing is a new photo. So if I've just learned to throw my inside flick, roll curve, panning out to the break side, break, have I done it exclusively in tailwind? Because if I have, then I need to add a photo into my album that is doing it in headwind. And if I've only ever done that in training, have I then got it in the tournament section of the album yet? If I don't, I need to try that. I never want to get ahead of myself and be putting it into the medal game of an elite tournament section before I've done it elsewhere, which is why you don't make crazy decisions in those moments. But I need to be able to build up the album over time. And I think it's really important for the captains and the coaches in the room to allow, at certain points of the season and of the year, to allow our players to build up their photo album. Because if they go into a training, one of the first 1 or 2 trainings of the year, and they try and throw a roll curve inside to the break side, and it's got too much roll and it hits the ground, that's absolutely fine. They should be throwing that repeatedly in those trainings and out on the field and in pickup and in these less impactful times or periods to then build up that album. I do think that going out and throwing with your friends and throwing in field work and just playing like random pickup in the park, that is like your base. And depending on what the team is that you play for, that might have slightly more restrictions on what you're able to try. I'm not saying go out and try your 60-yard hammer for the first time at training. You should have done that in your field work ahead of time. But I think doing it repeatedly will be your best teacher. You will be able to see where that success comes from by whether it's a completed pass or whether it gets blocked. And as you do it more and more, you are able to then identify where that success comes from. Because there isn't always going to be a coach with you to say, slightly adjust this angle or slightly adjust that angle or try this slightly differently. Sometimes you're going to need to go to a field and try that throw 100 times until you start to recognize the cues and the parts of the throw that are providing success, and you keep those and you get rid of the ones that don't. Sometimes it's difficult to identify those, which I can appreciate, but I think that is when it comes to implementing it in practices with your coaches and your captains, that you can maybe have that slightly more guided element to it as well. Does that answer the question? Cool. Yes. Here you are.
I have a follow-up question for that question, because in this picture the disc is in the middle of the field, so basically that undercut is kind of in an active space.
Which undercut, sorry?
Well,
From
the middle person has the disc, and then the person on the left side, if their defender's peeled off in the back, they can actually do an undercut, and it's kind of open, and it's kind of in an active space. How would that differ if the disc was on the right side in that position?
So I don't think that this should necessarily be a cut, is the first thing. I think it's that you are providing an available option in order to make the defense have to react. Usually that would be in the form of a cut, but when you have someone peeling off and you are in the inactive space, cutting in the inactive space is usually useless because it's the inactive space, right? So it's more so that you're moving into a more dangerous position that they start to have to respect it more. For the same reason in a zone why you don't go stand at the back of the end zone, because whilst you're completely free, you're not providing an option that can actually be hit. But as soon as you start to move towards just left or right of the deep, or just slightly deep of the deep, those options then become more available. Even though you're just standing still in a different position, you're threatening a valid option a little bit more.
So I guess my point is, if the disc is on the right side,
yes,
then even walking down towards the handler space wouldn't even be a good option because you're still in that space.
So for me, being in this position here as a fourth cutter, I love this position for two reasons. Either we're going to recognize that these three players are going to clear out of the space if the disc has just moved to the right, and Henry's cut from earlier on when he slashed all the way across the field, he was in that exact same position. A guy had peeled off to go and stop the deep stuff. He kind of had a guy on him, but not really. And we gained 10 yards because he was just able to slash directly across the field. Also, this handler cycle from when they've just drifted into this space. And I basically have a chat with this guy and say, there's a potential cycle here. I'm not screaming at him saying, you have to get out, I have to be in the handler space. I'm saying there's a chance here if you go up the line, I might be completely free behind you. Like, these are things that I would actually say on field. And if he decides to go up here, great. If he decides to clear up the line, and then I can follow, stuff like that. Like, this is, even though it's in the inactive space, I guess that's something I've not really touched on. The active space should only be moved into with all of these cuts from inactive positions. So if you're in an inactive position and you're not being marked, that means your cut into the active space could be even more devastating than someone who is being tightly marked as well. So this sort of position here, I think, is probably more dangerous than you think. And that's only the kind of second priority of that space. That person being there is either free or they are keeping a defender out of more valuable spaces elsewhere. So even if you're not getting the disc and you're not providing necessarily an option there, if you're being marked, great. They're staying on you, and that's good because it means there's more space elsewhere. No worries. Any other questions? No? Any other general questions before we wrap up? Yep. Mike.
Yeah, so my question, I guess it's more of a general question, and it's about like how do you balance in your teams, like between the theory like we just did and then like getting the experience on the field, because you need like everything to be intuition, but you also need to talk about things to maybe have, like having the solutions.
Yeah, good question. So for me, I think film review and diagram review like this is so important. I think it's fair to expect that not all 26 players on the team are going to really dive into a lot of that. So having a really dedicated core of coaches or captains who are willing to do so is vital. I think if you manage to get film to look back on each week or every other week, to look back and then get it in diagram form and discuss it in that way, is really valuable. Being able to show people this cut that you made actually cut this person off a number of times, and that's not the high value option we want. Showing them the film and then saying, actually, this is what we're looking for on the diagram. Really easy to share that with the team and go, you have to know this before we next go onto the field. Because if you don't, you're going to be ruining the session for everybody else. So yeah, I don't think necessarily everyone needing to be part of it is the way, but everyone buying in, very important. Yeah.
Okay, great answer.
Thank you. Anyone else? Last chance. Yeah.
What's your view on ambidextrous thrower? Is that something you would like to become in the future, or?
Good question.
Do you feel like there's positivity in, like, even you as a lefty in some situations doing the righty pivot and stuff?
Yeah. So I am no stranger to the fact and the idea that me being lefty has definitely helped with my progression and development to the point that I've got to. I think we have a natural advantage in the game just because of the way people mark, because of the way people expect throws to come out. That being said, I still use righty backhands because the flick and the backhand are very different styles of throw. I think the danger of working on something like being ambidextrous is that there are, for the vast majority of us, because we don't train full time, we weren't child athletes being just forced into playing Ultimate into a professional level, we don't have these 24-hour coaches available, things like that. There are generally always very high value areas of our game that we can be working on that provide very distinct improvements on the field. So for me, I have reached the point now where I'm in the gym twice a week, and that's it, because I know that me going to the gym 4 times a week is going to have, say, a 3% improvement on my physical ability. Me going out and throwing 3 times a week instead of 1 has been huge for my game. And that's going to differ for everybody. But I think unless you are a master thrower single-handed, I don't think that ambidextrous throwing is necessarily going to provide massive benefits that couldn't have been gained in an easier way by working on other parts of the game. Does that make sense? For the same reason why you don't go out and work on your 60-yard scubas until they're world class if you can't complete an open side flick, right? Because that opportunity is going to come around once every 3 tournaments, and you need to be able to complete an open side flick 20 times a game. So whilst it's a useful skill to have, that time and energy and like the points of the skill tree, like in Zelda or in Elder Scrolls or whatever, right, can be better used on other elements.
Thank you.
No worries. But I think it's also great. I love it. But yeah. Cool. Oh, last one? No? Is there a mic around? So that I think less so, because I think that that's a skill that we can probably learn quite quickly. I think if you're ever out throwing and you dedicate 15 minutes to your offhand every time that you do it, you're going to see distinct improvements in that very quickly. I think when you start to talk about certain breaks or certain deep shots and whatnot, I think that the vast majority of us, not even you guys or elsewhere, of us can improve on our strong hand elements of those a lot more, that would become a lot more useful than by me developing a 6 out of 10 righty hook, I might as well get my lefty hook to a much better position or work on my decision making to not throw it at all. You know what I mean? But for those of you that were in my Give Go session yesterday, we did some offhand stuff, and the one thing I said was we bring the pairs much closer together, because throwing a 5-yard offhand, we can learn and improve that dramatically in 30 minutes versus the more expansive throws. So yeah, really valid point. Doing that on those smaller, simpler throws is definitely useful. Anyone else? Awesome. Thank you so much for coming along. Thank you.